How how much of it in the way of introductory remarks would you like me to make, or do you want to make this more of a Q&A or discussion rather?
We'll probably make it Q&A based, because I feel I have confidence that a lot of our membership knows, you know, a lot about your work,
Yeah.
and you know, and I think that it's great to, you know, ask very thought-provoking questions that are not often asked in media, and you know, I think it's great to, you know, have conversations that are, you know, I guess more niche in a way.
Yeah,
But
fine with me.
on the topic. Okay.
I'll be back in just a moment. I'm going to go through my own security operation, which is to make sure that my home office door is locked so that the rugrats don't get in here. I'll be right back.
So how is it at Johns Hopkins University, sir?
Well, I'm actually, you know, I've been, I was the dean until last June, so I'm on sabbatical. So I really have not been, I haven't been on campus very much. I've been spending actually a little bit more time at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
It's a very great place.
Which is a great place. And of course, you know, it's nonstop.
Especially now. I don't know if Will mentioned to you, but the two of us went with 14 of his colleagues to DC a week and a half ago.
Oh, really?
As part of a travel course. And our theme happens to have been European IR. And his group was looking at, even before the Russian troops started accumulating on the border, we had chosen security in and around Ukraine as the theme.
Oh my gosh.
We had plenty to talk about.
I bet you did. I bet you did. Yeah. Well, you know, I went to the Munich Security Conference, and then I was in Warsaw when the war broke out. So that was quite an extraordinary experience, as you might imagine. It's and Washington's probably a little bit like that, and that, you know, people are really engaged in a pretty deep way.
Very much so. We were grateful that they kept their meetings with us, since almost every place we were visiting, the Polish embassy, the Czech embassy, the Greek embassy, and so forth, that of course their calendars were turned upside down as they try to secure different forms of American support.
Yeah, absolutely. Turn this off. So how often do you have these events, Will?
How often?
Yeah.
So we tend to have 2 in-person events and 2 virtual events every semester. Yesterday we hosted Dr. Jeffrey Gedman from, you know, Radio Free
For sure. Yeah, no,
and yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you here. It's not every day when we can have you guys speak to university students that are especially interested in foreign policy and defense issues like these. So I myself, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say credit to Will and his fellow leaders that they have really revitalized the AHS chapter here at Michigan. We opened a chapter about 5-6 years ago with some folks who were in ROTC in the engineering school, but it's never been more active than it is now. So that every month there's 1 or 2 events on foreign policy related themes, and often from people and from perspectives that don't have adequately represented on campus. So it's great.
I think that's wonderful. I was telling Will before he came on that when the Hamilton Society asked me to do something, I always try to oblige. I just think it's such a worthy effort and organization, and you know, the audience has just always been terrific. I've always enjoyed it.
Are you using your sabbatical time to work on a book?
I am, of all things, it's a book about Shakespeare. I'm writing a book on Shakespeare, on getting, using, and losing power. And it's based on a course that I taught called Rough Magic, from references to the Tempest. There are a lot of things that are applicable, oddly enough. So I mean, one of the plays that I write about is Richard III. And one of the things that you see is Richard III evolves from being a guy who's cunning and careful. He's a killer, murdering people. But when he becomes king, at a certain point, he just stops concealing it. And that's the point at which his downfall begins. And there's a bit of a parallel there with Putin, I think. Hold on, I'm just going to close the door. So, now, will I see the room at all, or?
Right, so we have a couple people in the waiting room, and some people are coming into our room as well. We will probably start in about 2 minutes and let everyone in then. So.
Well, the Shakespearean theme sounds very interesting, and I also have to say it's a nice thing anytime a book on the topic comes up that can bridge different audiences.
Yeah.
Since wonks like me are going to read all of the stuff that you write in conventional sort of strategy and IR, but somebody in the English department might pick this newest book up and really get a new exposure.
I don't know if you've read anything by Elizabeth Samet.
I haven't.
She teaches literature at West Point. She's written a couple of wonderful books. She wrote she annotated Grant's memoirs. She has a terrific anthology on leadership. But she is somebody who sort of bridges these worlds. And I'm just a tremendous admirer of her. And I've always had a horror of writing the same book twice. So, when you realize
I think over time that's become more and more of a virtue of having that horror. I see some people who just come up and they write the same book 16 times.
Unfortunately, the academic world rewards a bit of that.
Yes, it really does.
As you know, it's a great thing about being, an old guy. You don't have to worry about it. So you can...
I was talking to somebody about that over lunch today, how in addition to rewarding reproduction of similar ideas and just beating the drum until everyone has heard you make the same argument, there's also a reward to a group of people just cycling through the same conversation and citing one another 100 times each.
Oh, I mean, that part is really quite pernicious.
Right.
And I even know some people who've done that quite deliberately. No good at all.
Okay, should we start to let everyone in, or? Awesome. All right, cool. So thank you guys for coming in, as people in the Zoom, as well as people in the room. So good morning, everyone. This discussion is hosted by the Alexander Hamilton Society at the University of Michigan, a chapter of a nonpartisan, not-for-profit national organization that seeks to identify, educate, and launch young men and women into foreign policy and national security careers imbued with the Hamiltonian perspective of strong, principled American leadership in global affairs. We believe that the United States has a strong moral responsibility to play in the world and hold very true to the belief that the US ought to stay actively engaged in international affairs in order to advance international institutions, democracy, and freedom of enterprise. We're joined here today by our renowned guests, Dr. Eliot Cohen, as well as our moderator, Professor John Ciucciari of our chapters, who is our chapter faculty advisor, as well as an associate professor of public policy and director of the Ford School's International Policy Center and Weiser Diplomacy Center. His research, John Ciucciari's research focuses on international law and politics in the global South. He's the author of Sovereignty Sharing in Fragile States and co-editor with the Tsutsui of the Courteous Power, Japan and Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific era. Dr. Ciucciari has been an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, an AHS Society Fellow, a postdoctoral fellow at Stanford, a policy official in the US Treasury Department Office of International Affairs, and an associate international law firm. Dr. Eliot Cohen was the former dean of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Currently, Dr. Cohen serves as the Arlie A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security, and current professor at Johns Hopkins University, SAIS, and a regular contributor to The Atlantic and a co-host of the Shield of the Republic podcast. He served in the U.S. Army Reserve, was a director in the Defense Department's policy planning staff, led the U.S. Air Force multi-volume study of the first Gulf War, and has served in various official advisory positions. From 2007 to 2009, he was the counselor of the Department of State, serving as serving under Secretary Condoleezza Rice, senior advisor, focusing chiefly on issues of war and peace, including Iraq and Afghanistan. His book includes most recently The Big Stick, The Limits of Soft Power and the Necessity of Military Force, as well as Conquered into Liberty, 2 centuries of battle along the great war path that made the American way of war, among others. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and his commentary has also appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and on major television networks. So please welcome our speakers for today, and I'll yield the floor to Professor Ciucciari.
Thank you very much, Will, for organizing this, and to you and your colleagues for the great work you're doing at the Alexander Hamilton Society. Of course, thank you to Professor Cohen for joining us, a real expert in a variety of areas relevant to today's topic. We're going to speak about U.S. strategy, possible military or actually ongoing military involvement in various ways in the conflict in and around Ukraine, and policy options going forward. I know that we want to reserve most of our time this evening to allow chapter members to ask their questions, of which I'm sure there will be many. But Professor Cohen, if I may, I'd love to start off with a few questions of my own just to get some of the issues on the table. The first thing I'd like to ask about is the current US posture with respect to the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. You've written on this in a few prominent places. And one of the points that you make is about the stance that President Biden has taken with regard to the conflict, to say essentially, we're not going to get involved in Ukraine because any involvement that we would have that would involve direct combat with Russia would risk escalation to a World War III. And I have to say that having gone to Washington a week and a half ago with a group of University of Michigan students, we heard that refrain echoed in lots of the places that we visited. You've criticized that view, and I wonder if you could start by sharing your sense with the group on why that's the wrong approach for the Biden administration, for the president himself to take.
Sure. So first, let me just thank you for that warm welcome and say how pleased I am to be at an Alexander Hamilton Society event. It's a great organization. There are a number of reasons why it's. I think the administration is making a serious mistake. The first thing is you never tell your opponent that you're afraid of him and that you're afraid of what he might do, and you're afraid of a contest, because that always gives him the psychological edge. And it's not just in his relationship with you, but it's also in, say, with how the Ukrainians think about this. Secondly, it's not true. I mean, if we wake up tomorrow and the Russians are doing on a large scale what they did with their allies in Syria, drenching Ukrainian cities in sarin chemical weapons or other chemical weapons. I find it difficult to conceive that we would just watch hundreds of thousands of people choke to death. You know, the significance of what's going on is, I think really, you can't overstate it. This is in the heart of Europe, the kind of thing that went on in the middle of the last century. We thought we were out of that world. We are not out of that world. It will not end here. If by, because of our unwillingness to set limits, Ukraine is subjugated by Russia, it will not end there. It will end up on NATO territory. So I think it's a mistake, and I think there are probably people in the administration who are beginning to realize that it is a mistake. But in any case, it's handing a psychological advantage to your opponents, which you shouldn't. And by the way, one last point is people need to understand Americans and Russians have shot at each other before. There were Russian and American pilots dueling over Korea. There were Russian and American pilots, probably, as we believe now, dueling over Vietnam. And as recently as a few years ago, a Russian private military company, the Wagner Group, attacked an American base. Now, the Wagner Group is basically an extension of Russian special operations forces. They use the same training camps and so on. The United States Air Force killed several hundred of them in that attack. Not a peep from the Russians, not a word. So, obviously, any direct conflict is going to be very concerning. And you want to do whatever you're going to do carefully and prudently. But it is an error on multiple fronts to say there are things we just won't do.
On that note, some of the conversation in Washington is now engaging with the question of possible no-fly zone, humanitarian corridor. In between where we are now and the large-scale deployment of, say, chemical weapons on a Ukrainian city, what might be reasonable benchmarks to have in mind, conditions under which the United States should seriously consider operationalizing a no-fly zone?
So I'm not sure that I really like framing this in terms of a no-fly zone. The truth is, actually, most of Ukraine is sort of a no-fly zone already because both sides have surface-to-air missile systems. Neither is really able to fly particularly safely. There's not a whole lot of aerial combat going on. It's one of the things that's very striking, by the way, about Russian military performance is just how poor they've been in the air. Most of the damage is now being done by missile fire, long-range missiles and rockets, and by artillery fire. And to actually do the things you would need to do to bring in humanitarian aid, you'd have to really be taking out a lot of Russian air defenses. I think the bigger questions are we doing enough to supply the Ukrainians on the right scale and with the right level of urgency? And in terms of how you think about what might be the triggers for direct intervention, I think there are three possibilities. One is if there's an escalation involving tactical nuclear weapons. I would say, secondly, if there's a use of chemicals. Actually, I think four things. Chemicals. I think truly horrific humanitarian war crimes, some of which we're seeing. Just today, there was a theater that was bombed, which was clearly marked as a civilian refuge. I think there's a certain point where you just say we're not going to let you do that. And then fourth thing would be Russian aggression of any kind against a NATO member. The Russians fired this long-range missile at a training base just inside Ukraine. They may try something like that into a country like Poland. And people need to understand that the response from the West will not just stay within Poland or any other country that's attacked.
Right. You mentioned the importance of providing more support for Ukraine, and before the most recent announcements, when the U.S. had committed a few $100 million, you said, well, we're an order of magnitude off of the level of support we need in terms of the volume of financial assistance. In terms of the kinds of systems, what do you think, what types of hardware technology could the United States provide that would be most likely helpful in this type of combat?
So I think we actually are providing a lot of the most useful things. Let's divide them into a number of categories. One, the kinds of things that have gotten lots of attention: the Javelin anti-tank missiles, the Stingers. It sounds as though we will be supplying from other sources more sophisticated Russian-made surface-to-air missile systems. And that's a good thing to do, because the Stingers have a limited ceiling in terms of what they can hit. It's very, very effective against helicopters or low-flying aircraft, not so effective against airplanes flying higher, not effective at all. They just don't have the reach. And if the Russians, as unfortunately seems likely, begin pounding cities, you want to bring down the airplanes that are doing that. Again, according to news reports, we're going to be giving them different kinds of drones, including kamikaze drones, the Switchblade 600s, which are apparently extremely effective. So I think we're doing a lot of that. And there's really I think what people need to understand is it's not just one or two families of missiles. There's a very wide array of things like sniper rifles and heavy machine guns, and go on and on. Second thing are the non-lethal but really important supporting materials: body armor, night vision devices, combat medical kits. There's an awful lot of that stuff that armies consume, that armies need. And then the final category is more difficult. There, of course, as everybody knows, there's been this recent kerfuffle about the Poles wanting to provide MiG-29s, a rather old, not a great jet fighter, to the Ukrainians wanting it. My feeling about that one, and I've written about it, is I'm willing to concede that they might not actually make a huge difference to the Ukrainian Air Force, which has done actually rather well, all things considered. But as a symbolic gesture to a country that's fighting for its life, saying, look, we'll give you anything that you can operate, that we believe you can operate, to help you succeed. That actually was very important. And it was, again, to go back to the earlier discussion, one of the things that was extremely counterproductive about how the administration handled that was, we don't want to do that because that would escalate things. Well, how on earth does it escalate things? I mean, American weapons are killing Russians every day. So what's the difference between being killed by an anti-tank missile as opposed to by a fighter plane? It's absurd. So there are some of those, but I think the main categories we're doing. My concern has to do with scale. I think what everybody needs to understand, we will provide as much as is needed and as fast as is needed. I doubt very much that the current allocation, about $1 billion, is right. My guess is you're looking at an order of magnitude more than that, that would actually be required. And you want to do the things that signal to people that you're willing to do that. So, for example, I would like to see an announcement that where the factories that manufacture Javelins and Stingers and things like that are going to be going on a three shifts a day schedule, 7 days a week, or that we're going to pump those things out and get them over there. Because that, there's a material dimension to any war, and there's also a moral, psychological one. And we need to play in both.
You mentioned a moment ago that this is likely only to be the beginning, that we're entering a new chapter in which norms that we thought were reasonably solid have been breached in a very flagrant way. What does the United States need to be doing in terms of the defense of other European states, the Baltics, Poland, Romania, for example, that we're not already doing?
So what I would say is the norms are being breached in Europe. They've been breached in other places. It's just we haven't paid as much attention. And you might say, well, it's unfair, possibly even racist. If you look, we stood by in Syria, but there is something particularly blatant about this. There is something particularly shocking about just the magnitude of the aggression, and it's this unprovoked attempt to destroy a state of 40 million people that just wants to live its own life. I think with the rest, what we need to do is we need to make sure that our frontline partners, and here I'd say particularly the Poles, Romanians, Slovaks, and so on, but particularly the Poles, who are the key players, know that we are completely behind them. And that if, excuse me, if the Russians should choose to escalate this, we will be there. And not just symbolically, but we'll be there to fight on their behalf. I suspect that when this is over, and maybe even before that, we're going to change some of the things we do. So for example, now we have a rotating presence in Poland. Units deploy there for training, and it's usually pretty much nose to tail that when one unit goes out, another comes in. It's clearly time, it seems to me, for deployments, permanent deployments there, as we had during the Cold War, as indeed we have in other parts of Europe. Have more of those forces be forward deployed in places, in Poland in particular, so that they know that we really are there for them.
Of course, the Europeans are also taking steps to bolster their own defenses. What are your thoughts on the likely implications in the, say, 5 to 10 year timeframe of Germany's decision to vastly increase its defense spending and also to uncork the bottle in terms of its provision of lethal hardware?
So you're raising a really interesting issue. I think there's so many surprises in this conflict. And one of them is the quite extraordinary level of European consensus. And above all, I would say the willingness of the Germans really to turn on a dime. And they've committed to spending 100 billion euros, which is basically twice their annual defense budget in one go, just to modernize, as well as to increase their defense budget. I think we'd take it up by an additional somewhere between 25, 35%. So it hits the 2% targets. Actually, I think it's more than that. To, as you say, to supply arms to a hot conflict zone, Ukraine, to permanently suspend the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is just a monumental change. I think there are many ways in which this is going to turn out to be a disastrous choice on Vladimir Putin's part. One of them will be this tremendous strengthening of NATO, this awakening of Europe from its post-Cold War dream that they were no longer in the world of power politics. And I do think what you'll see is a number of European states beginning to play roles that they either have never played before or they only played a long time ago. Germany is certainly one, but I think Poland will be another. The Poles are going to be a more consequential country as a result of this. But the main thing will be the Germans. If the Germans do everything they've said they're going to do, then I think they end up as either the third or fourth biggest spender on defense in the world after the United States, China. I mean, that's a big deal. Yeah. And the question is whether German policy will kind of follow along with the implications of that.
Another important player, of course, not least because of its location across the Black Sea, is Turkey. A year ago, we were talking about Turkey potentially being booted out of NATO and hedging by buying hardware from the Russians. Now they've closed the Dardanelles and the Bosporus, appear, at least in the near term, to be taking a position more aligned with NATO partners. I wonder if you have thoughts about how this might affect Turkey's position in the strategic architecture of Europe and the Middle East going forward?
Yeah, again, very, very interesting. Of course, what the Turks are best known for in this conflict are the very capable unmanned aerial vehicles that they've been supplying to the Ukrainians, which the Ukrainians apparently operate very, very well, and which they've used to do a lot of damage to Russian forces. And the reporting would seem to suggest that actually the Turks have been shipping them more. I think the larger context here is Tayyip Erdogan, who may be coming to the end of his time in office, reconceiving the nature of Turkish foreign policy. They began with a phase with no problems with neighbors. They ended up with, no neighbors without problems. And I think that they are now actually falling back into what's a little bit more traditional. So obviously they are quite important to NATO. I think they have to be alarmed by Russia. It's interesting, they've been rebuilding their relationship with Israel, which was actually a very important security relationship with them until not long ago. So I think there's a general recasting of Turkish foreign policy. You see it in other places as well. So the Turks, one of the things that's been interesting is the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia, with the Turks really having to help arm the Azeris, again, with those drones, and really doing a job on an Armenian army that was basically a Russian-style army. So, and I think this is part of how the Turks think about their future in Central Asia. So we're seeing a lot of pieces shift on the chessboard of international politics. So this war it's going to be tremendously consequential and all over the world, including in Asia too.
If we continue sort of just moving geographically from west to east, what are some of your thoughts on how this might play out strategically in the Middle East, where you have mostly conservative Sunni governments condemning the Russian invasion, but you've got revolutionary movements, the Houthis, the Shia militias, Hezbollah taking the side of the Russians? Do you anticipate a major fissures in the Middle East stemming from not just the war itself, but from the depletion of available grains and other foodstuffs in the region?
So that is a consequence that folks in the Middle East have to worry about, that Russia and Ukraine, both major grain producers, may be off the market for a bit. And that could have all kinds of consequences for internal stability. My sense is actually most of the Middle Eastern states preferred not to get too involved. And that's why we saw UAE, Israel, even Saudi Arabia, just not engaging much at all. Now the UAE came around, the Israelis are playing this mediating role. We'll see if that goes anywhere. But I think most Middle Eastern states are completely absorbed in their own problems. They have a very transactional view of the Russians and indeed of the United States. They're sort of worried about the Americans leaving the region to deal with China. And so they're just going to be kind of warily watching, waiting to see where this thing goes. I mean, historically, that's not atypical for the Middle East. The story of the Cold War in the Middle East is as much about the locals trying to use the superpowers as the other way around. So they're not particularly going to engage in this one, I don't think.
Another country, of course, trying to stay out of it is India. Do you think it's tenable from a U.S. foreign policy perspective to give India a pass in the interest of keeping it as part of the Pacific-oriented Quad, to allow it essentially to stay out of the fray over Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I think up to a point, you're right. I don't think we have a whole lot of choice. I think India is becoming a more and more problematic partner, particularly as their commitment to basic norms of democracy weaken. I mean, this is something I think we see with the Modi government, which has become more and more of a Hindu nationalist government. It was always there. Modi himself was always there, but it's getting worse. And, one can have serious concerns about, increasingly, I think, about the nature of Indian commitments to liberal democracy, which has, by the way, major consequences for their internal stability. That said, I mean, we need them and they need us to deal with China. The Indians are innately a difficult partner to have because they, for a variety of historical reasons, do not want to see themselves as being in any particular camp, and will be very prickly about it. I think the result of this will be that relationship with India will continue. It'll be very transactional. And it'll be like that until India's internal politics may change, and they very well might at some point. There's just one other piece, which is, I'm not sure you look at this war and you come out thinking that Russian military kit is really what you want to have.
Right. We then can move over to China, and I wonder if you have thoughts on what forms of support, assuming that the war continues to go reasonably poorly from Russia's perspective, what kinds of support should we anticipate that China may provide to Russia, military, financial, or otherwise? And what might be reasonable US responses to hold China accountable for that, as the administration has pledged that it will?
Really interesting, difficult question. I mean, in fact, just the other night, I was at a dinner seminar with a lot of quite senior people wrestling with this. And it, usually there's a kind of Washington consensus, which is often wrong about all kinds of things. This was one where there was no consensus. And we had a whole bunch of, high-powered China experts in the room. We had some high-powered Russia experts, and you couldn't get them to agree. I was chairing the discussion. You couldn't get them to agree on anything, which was fascinating to me. And even today, we're parsing things. So Foreign Minister Lavrov hopped in a plane today, took off for China. Halfway there, the plane turned around and went back. That doesn't usually happen when foreign ministers travel. I travel with Condi. I never saw that happen. And I think, one speculation is that the Chinese said, maybe this isn't the best time. Or other little things. So one of the Chinese media outlets ran a story about an attack on a bread line in, I forget which Ukrainian city. And until now, the Chinese have not covered any Russian atrocity at all. But there was an op-ed in the Washington Post by the Chinese ambassador, which was very defensive. It was not directly critical of Russia. It was very defensive about China's status. So I think, here's my take. I think the Chinese are of mixed minds. I think Xi Jinping is in a different place than other parts of his government, but he is the boss. I think there is a relationship between him and Putin. I think that the fundamental strategic logic is that even though they are not allies, they are aligned against the United States, and that alignment is very important. And that China in general will view it as in its strategic interest to keep Russia a going concern. And the argument is that Russia and China want to be back to back in dealing with the United States. Mm-hmm. Russia looking out to Europe, China looking to the Pacific. So all that would suggest close alignment, a lot of support. Now, what does that mean? There, I think things get more complicated. We have some idea, which things have been leaked, of what the shopping list is. Okay, some things you would sort of expect, drones and so on. High-end precision-guided munitions that tells you the Russians don't have enough and that they're running out, and there's evidence of that on the battlefield. Meals ready to eat, rations. boy, that really tells you something about Russia. And you have to wonder what the Chinese are thinking about their ally. If these guys can't even manage to have,
Right.
enough shelf-stable rations to feed their army. And there, by the way, there is evidence, and you can see it in unclassified literature. You pick up on the Chinese side a kind of contempt for the Russians, as poor, they were stupid for letting their regime collapse back in 89 to 91. They've made a pretty clearly stupid mistake here. The war hasn't gone the way they thought it should. The Russians, for their part, when you look at their literature, you can see they're anxious, they're very status conscious. I think Putin is very status conscious. He doesn't want to be seen as subservient in any way to Beijing. So there's that complex psychological dynamic. There are even deeper issues, though, I would say. The first issue goes to really fundamentally different perceptions of what they want to do. I think the Russians would really like to break the current international order in some ways. I think the Chinese want to bend it their way. There's a big difference. I mean, we don't want either, but those are fundamentally different things. And so there's a tension there. I think Chinese businesses are going to be quite leery of leaping in to do business with Russia. And that's because of the fear of secondary sanctions. And this is going to be true of all kinds of people. So South Africa has been crazily supportive of the Russians. Okay, but if you're a South African company and your prospect is you can do business in Russia if you can find a way of getting your goods there, which is not a trivial problem, and you can get it financed, which is not a trivial problem, and you can get it paid for in money that you'd be willing to take as opposed to rubles, or you can do business in Europe and the United States. That's a no-brainer for a South African company. It's going to be a no-brainer for a Chinese company. And so I think there'll be hesitation there as well. Very last thing, and we have no way of knowing any of this, is how the Chinese assess the stability and the longevity of the Putin regime. They are consummately transactional. There will be no sentiment there. And this won't be like Hitler trying to rescue Mussolini because he felt he owed Benito something. They'll just drop him like a dead cat. I think it's complicated. I would say fundamentally at the moment, they don't want Putin to lose. They view Russia as an important associate, if not an ally. They're dead set against the United States, but I think there are real limits on what they're going to be willing to do for the Russians.
I'll ask one more question before we turn to our assembled AHS members for theirs. And that's to complete our tour around the world. We come back home to the United States. In a recent article, you quoted Winston Churchill in saying that the United States needs to look at what's happening in Ukraine and regain a sense of moral health and martial vigor. Basically, we've had it easy for a while in terms of confronting big power challenges, and this ought to punch right through the glass and get us to our senses. Tell us what you think that means in terms of domestic politics here, not just at the national sort of DC level, but in terms of our own participation as citizens in this democracy. What do we need to do to be ready to deal with this kind of challenge?
Well, I think there's one thing that's very heartening. So let me back up a bit. All of us, very much myself included, and as I'm sure some of you know, I was one of the original Never Trump Republicans. So I've been bemoaning the state of American democracy for a long time. I was doing it even before. I think a lot of us have been very concerned. 2016 election, Trump, the 2020 election, all that. And we've gotten used to being very negative. and almost to the point where we're not willing to accept good news. The good news here is if you look at Congress, there is a complete bipartisan consensus on the nature of the problem and what American policy should be. I mean, in the Republican Party, there are a few holdouts, Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene and Cawthorn, whatever his name is, Madison Cawthorn. But basically, there's unanimity, and that tells you something about, you know, the fundamental political health that we have. I think the second thing is we should use this as a moment to remind ourselves that, you know, there are first order issues at stake in the world. You know, and as we think about what are the things we've been squabbling about, and what are the things we've been preoccupied with, that kind of dwindles in magnitude as opposed to the spectacle of 44 million people fighting for the right to be free. You know, I'm from New England, and originally I'm from Boston originally, but immediately to our north is New Hampshire. And the motto of New Hampshire, which you see on the license plates, is "Live free or die." It comes from a toast that was given by General John Stark, who was a real Cincinnatus figure, fought in the French and Indian War, great hero of the American Revolution. And it was a toast that he delivered in absentia to a gathering of the veterans of the Battle of Bennington. And his toast was "Live free or die. Death is not the worst evil." And, you know, I think a lot of us would have kind of shifted a little bit uncomfortably. We thought that was a little bit corny, a little bit over the top. But I think when you see people living that way and acting that way, it's profoundly moving, and it affects how you think about your own citizenship. And then I'll just say one other thing, which is, you know, really addressed to the students here, which is not at that peak of emotional intensity. I hope at some point you'll read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, which is about cognitive psychology and particularly the cognitive errors that people make. One of them is called the hindsight bias, which is the tendency to say, well, we knew it all along. We were not surprised. What happened was inevitable, and I saw it coming. Truth is, we've had stunning surprises here, stunning surprises. And you should write them down while you're still feeling surprised before your brain tricks you into thinking that it wasn't a surprise and we knew it was going to happen. And some of those surprises have to do with Putin being crazier than we thought. Some of them have to do with the Russian military being incompetent. Some of it has to do with the heroism of the Ukrainian people and with a 44-year-old comic who people didn't take terribly seriously, rising to be this, you know, lion in defense of his people, Volodymyr Zelensky. And, you know, let's make sure that we never forget that the shock of saying, you know, that there can be people who are every man or every woman, and in a crisis, they can rise to the moment. And that's something admirable. That's something that we have to.
To the audience, your questions.
So thank you for the remarks kindly. So if you don't mind, I'll start with one question. So first of all, how can the West, especially NATO, adapt this arms sales policy to Ukraine based on the fact that the Ukrainian army, the Air Force is trained to operate Soviet military equipments, such as the MiG-29s and Sukhoi? This is sort of in line with the agreement or the failed agreement between the US and Poland to transfer MiG-29s to Ukraine due to caveat replacing them for discounted F-16 fighters And also, given that NATO members are required to scrap of its Soviet equipment, would you say that there's an opportunity for them to do so, especially in the Eastern blocs to Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and others?
So I mean, again, let me just be clear. I think the MiG-29 issue is symbolic. It's an older plane. I don't think it'll make a huge difference. I don't think, as I said, the airspace over Ukraine is contested because you have a lot of surface-to-air missile systems out there. The Ukrainians are quite good at operating them. I think the most important thing is getting good medium and high altitude surface-to-air missile systems to Ukraine. Those are things like the SA-10 and the SA-300, which other NATO members have, which the Ukrainians know how to operate, and which will work just fine against Russian aircraft. Now, I do think there's another dimension, which is helping our allies in Eastern Europe arm quickly. The United States has a lot of F-16s in reserve, sitting in the boneyard out in Arizona. The Poles are great fighter pilots, In fact, during the Battle of Britain, the squadron which had the largest number of kills against the Luftwaffe were the Poles. They were all had fled their country after the Russians took it over, and it was the Polish squadrons which were the best in the Royal Air Force, and they've kept that those skills since then. So what I would do is see if are there things we can do to accelerate the arming of our NATO allies in the East. And again, there's both a material reason to do it, but there's also, I think, a psychological reason to do it, so they know we're there with them.
I'll ask for some other, sorry, Will, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so just one last question before I give it to the audience, both in the Zoom as well as the our in-person audience in the auditorium. So given that THAAD or Aegis system takes time and trained operators for deployment, could those systems be deployed in Western Ukrainian oblasts under Western command to prevent a nuclear escalation? And if so, how can the US and its NATO allies enforce such a nuclear umbrella or a selective safe no-fly zone?
So I'm not sure a no-fly zone, as we usually understand it, is completely plausible. When we had a no-fly zone over southern Iraq and northern Iraq, periodically we'd have to take down Iraqi air defenses, which had already been very badly hammered in the 91 war. So I don't know about that. I honestly, I don't know. I think here you're going to get very quickly down into the weeds. Different generations of the same aircraft can be quite different. I don't know whether the Ukrainian pilots are so good that they could operate the MiG-29s that they've got right away. My view is I don't see a problem with the Poles, them flying from Polish bases to Ukraine, or if you want to fly them to Ramstein and then have Ukrainian pilots pick them up. I don't think it makes a difference. As I said, I think it's largely symbolic. I think the most important things right now are, as I said, a real flood of the arms that they can use, including surface-to-air missiles and so on. But I think the other part of this, is NATO making sure that it has the capacity, should the time come, to destroy elements of the Russian air defense system in Ukraine. So if NATO wants to be able to operate against, missile launchers that are throwing thermobaric munitions into Ukrainian cities, which are incredibly destructive weapons, they would need to be able to overfly them. And they'd need to have the airspace enough under control so that they could take those systems out, which they can certainly do. That's a non-trivial challenge. I'm absolutely confident we could do it, but those are the kinds of preparations I think you really want to have. And by the way, the Russians would pick up on those preparations, and I think it would sober them up.
Thank you. So we'll go now to some questions, as Will said, and if you're in a position where it's easy for you to switch on your camera when you ask your question, we'd love to see you. No worries if you are not. But Will, you, I gather, can see people who have questions in the audience. And so maybe I'll turn to you first and see if there's anyone there who wants to start with the questions.
Right. Actually, there's a couple of hands raised in the audience currently. So I'll make Ray the co-host here, and then we're going to play it here from now. So Ray. Okay.
Okay.
Hello.
It sounds like we've got a little bit of an echo. So I have a suggestion, Will, if you don't mind. Maybe people who are in the audience can come down to your computer and ask questions from your laptop. While they're assembling in line there, we can go first to one of our Zoom questioners, which is Yulia.
Mute your mic first.
Yulia, I think you're got to unmute.
My apologies. There's been some technical difficulties on this end.
Okay.
So we'll unmute. Please. Actually. Okay, now Yulia should be able to unmute.
Okay, Yulia.
Able to unmute or is she asking a question?
Yulia, it looks like you're good.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh,
Thank you. Yes, yeah, I couldn't unmute myself. I apologize for that. It said I had no access to option. Well, I would like to thank the host, and I have a question. Well, back in 2007 and 2008, during Putin's meeting with George W. Bush, Putin told Bush in Ukraine is not a country. And then
Well, it looks like Yulia's connection was bad. And so maybe we'll come back to her. And why don't we have the folks in the room there come up to your computer and ask their questions?
Yeah.
yeah, that will work. You first. There you go.
Hello, Professor Cohen. My question is, in the case of Ukraine, we've seen the West pouring in a large amount of military hardware, including very sophisticated weapons such as the Javelin and now the Switchback loitering munitions. And we know countries such as Russia have a close relationship with China, who would inevitably get their hands on these weapons at some point and may possibly reverse engineer them. So when it comes to the security risk with material being sent to Ukraine, what can the West do to ensure that it doesn't end up in the wrong hands or make considerations when sending weaponry?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think the answers to that
Hear you, sir.
are they're usually very technical. I would say that I think it's fair to say that we don't export any weapons that we just assume the bad guys won't somehow get their hands on,
Sir, I don't
or get access to in one way or another. And again, with any weapon system, there are many, many different modifications and versions.
You guys be
And so, particularly in the case of, I know in the case of Javelin, these are not the latest models, which say the United States military would have. But at the end of the day, this is our price for doing business. And, it's the nature of military competition that it just never stops. So whatever the technology of today is, there'll be a better technology tomorrow. And a lot of what you're trying to do is to make sure that however good your technology today is, you're always innovating. So, if you need to move beyond it or even to counter it, you'll be able to do that. But I think it is one of the risks. I think, like I said, there are technical things you can do to mitigate that. And I believe that's what we do.
Thank you. And as you ask your questions, it'd be great if you introduce yourself and just say a word about what you're studying at UM and your interests. So next question.
It's down again.
just around there.
Oh, okay. Okay. It's working, right? Okay, yeah. Okay. My question is pretty simple. I wanted to ask about the current status because there's been a lot of, and this is just going to be speculation, there's been a lot of comments around, oh, the sanctions and cutting out the 11th largest economy from the world, from the global ecosystem will have effects that'll lead to the US dollar not being the global reserve currency anymore. I just wanted to really get your thoughts on that whole thing. Personally, I think it's kind of exaggerated.
Yeah, well, I'll let the economists speak to that, but I think the people who have to worry about the sanctions are the Russians, not us. Look, the world's going to suffer an economic shock from this, but basically, what Russia contributes to the global economy are raw materials. It needs from the rest of the world all kinds of manufacturing things. Will the price of oil go up? Probably. Is there reserve production capacity in the United States and the Middle East? Yeah. Is the world already in the middle of a transition, not away from complete reliance on fossil fuels, but to a much more diverse bag? I think so. Will this accelerate it? You bet. Prices go up. And, that part I do remember from my economics classes. Guess what? People's behaviors change. And, they begin buying different things. Plus, there's a lot of the technology is moving very quickly, even on things which are, sound like science fiction, like fusion. So, the oil is really the big issue here. There's some issues, I think, associated with, particularly rare minerals, but even there, you always, when it is lucrative enough to dig for stuff, it turns out that you have more stuff all around the world than you thought. And that's always been true. People have always, I remember going back to the 70s and 80s, people were talking about how the world was going to run out of oil. And then it turned out if you increase the price of oil, there's a lot more oil out there to lift. On the other hand, I think, what the Russians are going to be hit by is monumental. The estimates that I've seen is for this calendar year alone, at least a 10% hit to GDP, with some people saying as high as 25%. That is huge. And it's not like that is just kind of shaved off the top. It's things like they've shut down their car factories. The manufacturer that's not a particularly good car, the Lada, because guess what? It needs microchips.
I'll comment as a Treasury veteran on the question about currency. These sanctions are harsh in many of the traditional ways, individual level sanctions, freezing assets, higher tariffs. revocation of most favored nation trading status, but there are a couple ways, two in particular, that are really new that used to be referred to as the nuclear options in sanctions policy. One is, of course, to cut off many Russian financial institutions from SWIFT, the messaging system that banks use to settle their accounts at the end of the day, basically the lubrication for international finance. And secondly, to cut off the Russian central bank from foreign transactions and to freeze half of its $640 billion of assets. Those really are game-changing type sanctions. They don't create the impetus for parallel renminbi-centered systems in world finance, but they accelerate it, just as Professor Cohen said about some of these other trends. They provide a kind of activation energy for certain countries to transition to those alternative systems. I think that the sanctions are appropriate given the scale of the challenge that we're facing, but I think we should be clear-eyed in recognizing that they will in fact accelerate the development of alternative non-US dominated systems for finance.
I think that's true. By the way, did you work with my friend Adam Zubin at
I sure did. He was the head of OFAC when I was in Treasury.
Great guy.
Yep, agreed. Very, very talented.
And extremely talented. It's a small world, isn't it? Yep. I think that's right, but I mean, the renminbi to some extent was going to displace the dollar a bit, but at the end of the day, I think the dollar and the euro and the yen collectively are going to remain dominant, if only because these places are going to be transparent in a way that China isn't, and law-abiding in a way that China isn't. So I think the idea of, the renminbi being the world's reserve currency, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. It'll play a larger role. And I agree, it'll accelerate efforts to try to cut this off. By the way, that's what that brings up is something I should have said about China. I think they will look at this and say, okay, the Russians were really stupid here. What do we need to do to make sure that if we want to do something like this to Taiwan, we get away with it? And that would be get away with it militarily, which I think leads them to think about, make sure you settle this in 3 days. And financially, I think they'll be thinking deeply about that. By the way, on the reserve question, and I'd be curious to know what your view is. I mean, a good chunk of the remaining reserves that they can get their hands on is gold. And it's just not clear to me that, I mean, that's actually as useful as you might think. You begin selling all that gold, first you have to have somebody to buy it, which could be an issue. But secondly, that's going to bring the price of gold down. So the very act of trying to cash in on your gold is going to make your stockpile worth less. Am I misunderstanding something?
I agree. I also think that doesn't do any favors for the ruble, which is already plummeting, and for Russia to deplete those resources. So it's not a surprise to me that they're essentially announcing to the world that they're going to start defaulting on loans. It's a game of chicken that they're trying to play, and they will likely lose.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I just, one last thing on that. I think the damage that's going to be done to the Russian economy here is monumental. Like, what Western companies will want to go back in there, particularly if the Russians have confiscated, all of their assets in Russia. I mean, it just, what's the impact of, I think, several 100,000 people have now fled Russia. And my guess is a lot of those people are people with thumb drives in their pockets, the kinds of talents that you would want for a modern economy. I mean, the long-term damage that they're doing to themselves here is, I believe, truly monumental.
Yes, agreed. I see that Michael Bradshaw has a hand up on the Zoom link. So Michael.
Hello. I would like to ask you about the potential long-term impacts on European policy of this crisis that's unfolding. As I'm sure is being given away, this is, by my accent, this is of particular interest to me. But even since this war started, we've seen an enormous pivot in German policy, a very large-scale rearmament program. We've also seen Denmark rescind their obstruction of the EU army, which of course is a much vaunted project that's been hobbled for many years now. In general, do you think it's possible that the European Union could emerge out of this as a more coherent global actor than it has been in the past? And will it shift its long-term, will it finally abandon its long-term reliance on the US to underwrite its defense? And what sort of effects could we see on the global balance of power if that happened?
So I think the European Union definitely comes out of this a much more coherent and effective actor. You know, the Ukrainian membership in the EU will be a big deal. On the security side, I don't think there's going to be an EU army. I think for a couple of reasons. First, it would leave out some of the more capable militaries, including the British military at this point. But the main thing is the reason why NATO works is it keeps the United States in and engaged. And other countries too. I mean, I'll mention one that people don't pay much attention to. Canada, our gentle neighbors to the north. The largest number of trainers, foreign trainers in Ukraine prior to the war were Canadians, Canadian soldiers. The reason is Canada has a large Ukrainian population. But in any case, I think people will always want to have the American guarantee. And the capabilities that really only the United States can provide to really integrate the different forms of military power that you have there. But having said that, like I said, no question in my mind that the EU is a much stronger actor. I think it, you know, if it does well, its self-confidence will be reflected in other in other dimensions. So we're going to see more of them on the stage. Clearly, NATO's been revived in a way that I think many people were very concerned about it. It'll transform our relations because, you know, Americans have been nagging Europeans to hit their 2% targets for decades. If they begin hitting them, a huge source of friction in the alliance goes away. And finally, you know, we're not going to invade Russia. It's quite possible that Putin hangs on to power for quite some time. It's quite possible that even if he exits, you know, with a gentle or not so gentle assist from somebody else, Russia will be seen as a deeply problematic country, as it should be. I mean, this is a manifestation. Part of what you have here is a very dark manifestation of the Russian imperial impulse. The desire, which a lot of Russians share, to essentially reconstruct the Russian Empire. And so I think what we should expect, we can always be surprised, but what we should expect is that for the next decade or two, maybe even longer, the West will have to kind of be standing on guard as it looks to the East. And you know, it'll be, in one way, a lot easier than it was during the Cold War, but it'll still be a challenge. And you know, that'll keep us fully engaged.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's go back to Yulia, who was asking a question when her connection broke up about Bush meeting Putin in 2007, 2008, and their discussions over Ukraine.
Yes. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, good. I would like to briefly introduce myself just because you requested that. So my name is Eliot Smith. I am a senior at the University of Michigan, majoring in political science. I'm originally from Ukraine. And my question is, do you think the United States and the West beginning to feel remorseful about not listening or not wanting to listen Ukrainian government and Ukrainians about doing some preventative sanctions, some preventative steps before it all blew out into our faces? And like in 2007 or 2008, when Bush was meeting with Putin told Bush directly that, you know, NATO shouldn't go into Georgia, shouldn't expand because Ukraine is not a country. and then in his opinion, and then with the annexation of Crimea, I think personally the Obama administration was soft on Putin, and then the escalation of the war in the east of Ukraine gave Putin another chance to go on with his plans, and kind of the West and the United States didn't do much at all, just condemning his plans. So do you think at this point there is a remorse, some kind of, for not preventing or not doing something to stop this? Thank you.
Sure. Well, first, let me say this has to be a difficult time if, watching your country go through what it's going through. So you have my my sympathy on that, because it has to be tough. So I was in the government actually at that time, and actually the Bush administration's policy was to favor eventual NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. And I actually flew with Secretary Rice to Georgia during the war. We're together, really the French, but we were kind of behind the scenes negotiating the ceasefire. And I think we were all, the general sentiment had been in favor of putting, actually specifically Georgia and Ukraine, on a pathway to NATO membership. That was a controversial policy. There were a lot of people who were dead set against it. I do vividly remember, and I mentioned this in one of my articles in The Atlantic, we came back and went through Brussels, and this was in 2008. And my boss, Secretary Rice, said to the assembled foreign ministers, said, this time next year, I'm going to be playing golf in Palo Alto. But if you don't do something about this, you're going to be sitting here discussing Ukraine. And she was off on the timing, but the idea was right. I think, but of course, the Georgia crisis, which was really the moment where people said, whoa, it came at the very end of the Bush administration. So there really wasn't time to reset the policy. I think the Obama administration came in very naive. I think they believed that all this stuff was, tension with Russia, that's an artifact of the Cold War. I was a member of then Governor, now Senator Romney's presidential foreign policy advisory team. And I vividly remember that debate in the 2012 election with Obama sort of dismissing his concerns about Russia in a way that was, I thought, arrogant and misplaced, and as we now know, dead wrong. And I think the Obama administration actually did further damage by setting a red line in Syria that was not a red line. I mean, that was a terrible moment, and I'm sure the Russians noticed that. And then really a failure to react to Crimea, and then you have Trump. And I believe John Bolton, I think, who was Trump's national security advisor, I think if there'd been a second Trump term, he would have tried to take us out of NATO. And it's not because Putin thought he was a tough guy that he didn't make any moves then. It's because he didn't think he was going to have to. And why not wait till the Americans pull out of NATO on their own? I mean, it would have been catastrophic. Now, the people in his administration were not that way. And so you had this bizarre, truly bizarre situation where the president has one policy and the bureaucracy has a completely opposed policy. So they mitigated a lot of the damage, but he bears a lot of responsibility too. Really, though, to answer your question, Yulia, here's the sad thing. People don't feel remorse. Political people, politicians, leaders, just pick up and move on. And they don't, that's not entirely true. There are times when people do. But that's one of the reasons why I began the conversation by saying, hold on to this moment. of surprise and shock, and don't let it escape you, and don't forget where you were wrong, because we're all wrong. I mean, there's no shame in that. But I don't think you're seeing a whole lot of remorse. I'm sorry. I wish I could say there was. And really, my prayers with you and your family and your countrymen and women.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you for your question, Yulia. Why don't we go now to Courtney, who has had her hand up in the Zoom.
Yes, could you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Hello, Dr. Cohen. It's an honor to meet you. I'm actually a UMICH alumnus. I actually just graduated with my master's in global policy at Northwestern, but I wanted to get your thoughts on Belarus and Central Asia's role in the situation, because two of Russia's major allies, Kazakhstan and Belarus, are still very hesitant in supporting Russia. Even Belarus, which is allowing Russian troops to enter Ukraine through the north, is refusing to contribute troops themselves. And the entirety of Central Asia is pretty quiet on the incident.
So on Belarus, I think President Lukashenko is a despicable character. Let's just stipulate that. But he wants to survive in power, and I think the early phase of this crisis, I mean, the pressure. And even before, because he faced such internal discontent, he had to rely more and more on the Russians to hold on. And one of the adverse consequences of this crisis could be Belarus, in essence, being reabsorbed into Russia. On the other hand, you have to ask, well, why haven't they done more? And they haven't. And I think it's quite clear. There's, I think, reporting which is at least suggestive, if it's not conclusive, that it's quite clear that the Belarusian military would mutiny. There's been stories of Russians sending in their own officers. Those guys will never be able to sit with their back to a door. If I don't think there are many people in Belarus who want to go after the Ukrainians, who are practically cousins. And they don't want to, and I think they probably have enough access to information to know this is one hell of a mess. And so if they try something that desperate, I think there's a good chance you'd get a mutiny, and with all kinds of unpredictable consequences. The thing that's interesting about the Central Asians is they are obviously keeping their heads down. And there's some, like the Tajiks, who really need the Russians, so they're kind of stuck. If you look at Kazakhstan, where the Russians engaged briefly to support the current government, and then disengaged, my feeling is they're careful because they feel they have to be careful, to some extent the way the Israelis feel they have to be careful because they depend on Russian goodwill to be able to operate in Syria against the Iranians. But they don't want to go back to being part of the Russian Empire. And in fact, one of the things I think is fascinating is there's circumstances on the ground have changed. So whereas I believe it's the case that when Kazakhstan became a country, which nobody ever would have expected, a plurality of the population was Russian, essentially. That's no longer the case. The overwhelming majority are Kazakh. And the Russian minority is getting smaller and smaller, is going back to Russia. Plus, Kazakhs have had a higher birth rate. So, I think part of what makes Putin dangerous is he's living in this fantasy world where you can reestablish what was the Russian Empire. And I just don't think it's going to work. And I think he greatly underestimates the amount of resistance that he would get in this enterprise. But at the moment, I think those governments are just going to lie low, try not to antagonize the Russians, try not to antagonize their own populations, and hope that, excuse me, when the dust settles, they'll be able to get on with their lives.
Thank you. Will, did you have any other questions there in the room? For some reason, we're not hearing you at the moment, Will. It does not look like you're muted. In the meantime, as he looks at his sound system there, if anyone else has a question, I see Yulia may have another question. You can go ahead, Yulia.
Yes, I do have another question. So there's been talks with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky to meet with Putin.
You guys
And
hear me now?
what do you think?
Awesome. So
Will, we can hear you again, so. Okay, so Yulia's question.
It's not mine. Oh. Yeah, it's not mine. Mine is muted.
Yulia, your question was about Putin meeting with Zelensky, I believe.
Yes. What do you think? What are the stakes? What do you think, or how do you think Ukraine should approach that? Or do you believe there can be any significant results from that meeting? I mean, like the end of war.
So with Russia, I think President Zelensky wants to save his country from being reduced to a rubble field, and tens of thousands of civilians are being killed. That's on the one hand, particularly if he has any doubts whatsoever about the solidity of Western backing. On the other hand, he has to know that the Russians are fundamentally, absolutely untrustworthy. You just have to assume that everything they say is a lie. And furthermore, I don't think you can be assured of your physical security if you go to a meeting with Putin. There are enough examples from Soviet history where you come to a negotiation and next thing you know, you're in the Lubyanka. So, but I understand why he's willing to take those risks for his country. But I have grave doubts about what kind of negotiation you can really have. I mean, maybe you feel you have to do it. Maybe there's talk about what a settlement might look like. I find it unconvincing. I do think, by the way, and I know we're coming to the end of our time here, I think the Russian military is really in a world of hurt. And I think if the fighting goes on at the current level of intensity for another couple of weeks, you'll be seeing Russian units collapsing. Mutinies, mass surrenders, desertions on a really large scale. And I think you're already seeing that. The Ukrainians you're now seeing more reports of Ukrainian counterattacks. You're seeing more, one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at the inventories of equipment, some of which have been compiled and with a great deal of ingenious research by open source intelligence kinds of organizations. Increasingly, what you're getting is a lot of equipment that's been abandoned. And that the Ukrainians are now using. I mean, the Ukrainians are actually, I believe by some counts, Ukrainians have more equipment than they started with, even though they've had losses. And the reason is because they're getting Russian equipment. So I don't know. I have no idea how it turns out. But I think in 2 weeks' time, this will be a very different situation.
Thank you. I realize that we are just about at the end of our time, and we want to be respectful of your time, Professor Cohen. So let me hand back to Will just to wrap up and thank you.
Okay, so I presume you guys can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Awesome, great. So again, we would like to be respectful of your time, but huge apologies for the technical difficulties. But again, please please give thanks to our renowned guests, Dr. Eliot Cohen, as well as Professor Chuchar for coming here, both from the audience in person as well as the Zoom audience that we have. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Will. Thanks, everybody in the virtual audience, real audience. Professor Chuchari, next time you're in town, give me a call.
Sounds great. Will do.
Very good. Well, thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Good night.